Welcome to the Planet Trillion Trees podcast. I'm Eva Monheim.
And I'm Hal Rosner. We are both certified arborists through the International Society of Arboriculture. The purpose of our podcast is to encourage tree planting and proper tree care for our urban forests, which include neighborhoods, parks, and other open spaces.
We will also cover a myriad of tree topics, including the important role trees play in relationship to the climate crisis. Thank you for joining us. The Planet Trillion Trees podcast is happy to announce that we have won 2 Garden Communicator International Silver Laurel Medal Awards for Best Podcast and Best Podcast Episode. We've also won a Garden Communicators International Gold Laurel Medal Award for a Best Podcast Episode. We'd like to thank Garden Communicators for their recognition. The Andalusia Garden Symposium returns to Andalusia Historic House Gardens and Arboretum on Thursday, May 1st, with 4 amazing guest speakers: Joe Thompson, Kelly D. Norris, Asa Gregors-Warg, and Charlotte Harris. This year, this inspiring all-day event will be held entirely on the picturesque grounds of Andalusia. Don't miss your chance to hear from some of the most influential and innovative voices in horticulture and gardening. Landscape architects in Pennsylvania can receive 4 continuing education credits by attending. Purchase your tickets today at andalusiapa.org.
Verdant Earth Educators provides dynamic in-person training and online learning opportunities for environmental and horticultural businesses. Owned by ISA certified arborists and former university faculty, the Verdant Earth Educator team provides consultations on tree care and recommends climate-resilient opportunities for your valued green spaces. Verdant Earth Educators is all about seeding knowledge for success. Find Verdant Earth Educators at verdanteartheducators.com.
Monheim Microphones designs and handcrafts top-tier studio microphones and preamps right here in the United States in Hollywood, California. Their incredible line of innovative microphones and designs are used around the world by everyone from podcasters to top-charting record producers and singers. Monheim Microphones, unparalleled excellence. MonheimMicrophones.com. The Urban Wood Network gives people strength in numbers and a collective voice to showcase the growing environmental impact of an industry like urban wood utilization. This is really critical in a world where resource recovery and carbon storage benefits can go a long way to meet the needs of climate sustainability goals of cities, businesses, and consumers. Contact us at urbanwoodnetwork.org. This podcast is being recorded on February 28th, 2025. Jamie Biddle is the founding partner and CEO of Verdis Investment Management, a single-family office. Jamie is the chairman and president of Andalusia Historic House Gardens and Arboretum, and vice chair and board trustee and chair of the Museum Committee of the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. Jamie is behind portfolio construction, manager sourcing and selection, due diligence, and risk management. Jamie brings more than 2 decades of investing and operating experience across asset classes and industries. Prior to forming Verdis Investment Management in 2004, Jamie was president and CEO of Orcom Solutions. He earned his master's in business administration from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania and a bachelor's degree from the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome to the Planet Trillion Trees podcast, Jamie. We're delighted that you could be with us today.
It's great to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
We're so excited because your garden and Andalusia itself plays such an important role in our region. And that's why we wanted to have you on and to talk about how important Andalusia is from a historical perspective, number one, but number two, the whole idea of you conserving your green forests that you have on the property. And also that you have a symposium that is world class. So if you could talk a little bit about each one of those topics, it would be really very helpful for us and for our listeners to hear about Andalusia.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll start with a little bit of background for those who aren't familiar with it. So Andalusia is a 100-acre property. It sits right on the Delaware River, about 13 miles north of Center City. And it's literally just over the city limits of the city of Philadelphia. And a little bit of its history, in 1793, there was a yellow fever epidemic in the city of Philadelphia, and it killed 5,000 people out of a total residency of 50,000. Think about it, that's 10% of the population died. In COVID, about 0.3% of the population died. So the yellow fever epidemic was just extraordinary. And so it frightened Philadelphians. And if you had money, you tried to figure out how to get out of town in the summer, because at the time they didn't realize it was mosquitoes. They thought it had something to do with the summer air, but the idea was to get your family out of the city in the summer. And so a wealthy merchant named John Craig bought the property that's now known as Andalusia and moved his family there in the summer. And he named it Andalusia because his business was the importation of goods from Spain and from Latin America. And so he began a process of transforming the original house that was there. And then his daughter, Jane, married Nicholas Biddle in 1811. And Nicholas Biddle was sort of a Renaissance man. He went on to become the banker for the United States, head of the second bank of the United States, controlled really all the finances of the young country. Think sort of J.P. Morgan before J.P. Morgan. He ran what today would be the Federal Reserve, but it was a private bank at the time. So Nicholas Biddle was a very wealthy man, but also fascinated of all kinds of things. He was a lawyer, he was a scholar, and also very interested in agriculture. And so that's the first beginnings of agriculture and then eventually horticulture at Andalusia was Nicholas Biddle, who started with really cows and experimenting with mulberry trees for silk. So in the beginning, it really wasn't a formal garden. It was a summer escape from the city and the heat. And that evolved generations later when his grandson marries a woman named Letitia Glenn from Baltimore. And she's a young bride, and she arrives at Andalusia in 1888 and begins the process of creating formal gardens for the first time. And so she introduces formal flower beds and also was instrumental in contributing to the expansion and passion of horticulture in the country. And so she helps start the Garden Club of Philadelphia, which is formed at Andalusia in 1804. And then later that expands to the Garden Club of America, which signs its charter at Andalusia in 1913. And then she's also one of the founders of the Pennsylvania School of Horticulture for Women, which was founded in 1911 and is now, as you guys know, the Temple Ambler campus, where my wife went to school and got her degree in horticulture. So Letitia Glenn was really an extraordinary woman and really had a huge impact on gardening in our community, but also nationwide. So that's sort of a long history of the property. It passed from her to her son, my grandfather, Charles. He was a lawyer. He was very interested in trees, so he started planting trees on the property. It then passed to my father, who had a terrific design sensibility. He ran the American wing at the Metropolitan Museum in New York and then the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So my dad was really interested in things that were beautiful, and so he started planting a lot of the formal gardens that are there at Andalusia now, the original White Garden, the Green Walk, the conifer border. That was all my dad. And
Wow.
then when he passed in 2005, the responsibility of the property passed to myself and to Krista. And we were 38 years old at the time. We had 3 young kids, our oldest of which is autistic. So we had a lot on our plate. I was busy working, and the last thing we were thinking about was managing a very large public garden. And but that became its own journey for us. We hired a consultant shortly after my dad died to help us think through what to do with the property. We had this historic house that was now open to the public. My dad had started that in 1980. But it was only open by appointment, so visitation was very low. by design. And we had to think about, how do we preserve the property and who are we preserving it for and how do we share it? And the consultants we hired were experts in house museums. So they came back and said, well, you have this very important house and you have to save it. But the problem is nobody's very interested in house museums anymore. So good luck. And that was kind of, the report was more substantive than that. But that was sort of my takeaway.
Wow.
Was, okay, well, we have to preserve this house, but nobody really cares. So what do we do? And our answer was it had to be the gardens and the grounds and the trees, that it was going to be the outside that would save the inside. And so we began what's been a long journey of investing in the property and its gardens. And we started in 2014. We hired Arabella Lennox Boyd, who's a very famous English landscape architect. And Krista and I had been looking through garden magazines and all our garden books. And every time we saw a garden we loved, we would flag it and show each other. And we kept flagging these gardens by this woman named Arabella Lennox Boyd. And we'd never heard of her, didn't know anything about her. And so I looked her up on the internet. She was based in London. And there was this lovely picture of this kind of woman in her late 30s, early 40s on her website. So I was in London for business one day and went over to see Arabella, and in walks a woman in her mid-70s. And I was thinking, well, isn't this nice that this lady's here, but I wonder when Arabella will walk in. And then I finally realized that this was Arabella, and her website photograph had not been updated in a while. And we hit it off immediately. She was very much reminded me of my grandmother, a very strong woman of great charm and that sort of British sophistication, but also that kind of, steely, if you've ever watched Downton Abbey, very much like the grandmother, right? Arabella has components of that. And so we thought she was a perfect fit. And so she's really helped us develop a master plan for the property. And we began implementing it in 2017. And since then, we planted 15,000 plants, probably 600 or 700 trees. So it's been a journey. And we've also been experimenting with opening the property more and more. So we're now open 3 days a week from April through October, and now 8 Saturdays a year. And each year our visitation has been going up about 70% a year. So we're sort of bumping up against all of those nice to have problems like parking and bathrooms and lighting and signage. So that's a new journey for us. So that was a long answer to the history of Andalusia, but
I have to tell you that every time I bring students to Andalusia, it's their favorite garden. And I really think that it has to do with the sense of spirit that's on the property. It has a really wonderful energy, and you're right on the Delaware River. So there's not many places that are on the Delaware River. And you get a perspective of how people would have transported themselves up to your home from the river when there weren't any major roadways like we have today. Now everything's reversed. So the river now becomes the quiet part and the roadways become the busy part. But that whole idea of that switching from river to road, it was a big one. And noticing on your property when you drive in, that real quiet, almost spiritual sense when you drive down the driveway, there's that feeling you're driving through a woodland and it is so ancient and it just makes you feel really good. By the time you get to the garden and the house, you're like beside yourself. It's an awe-inspiring property.
It's a special spot. And I think part of it, as you point out, is the city has grown right around Andalusia. So it's sort of a 100-acre oasis sitting what is now in Northeast Philadelphia, Lower Bucks County. So you come out of the city and you're still in the city until you come down the driveway. And then suddenly you escape into the woods and into the quiet, but also back in time, because nothing has changed at Andalusia very much in the last 225 years. So it's pretty much exactly as it was.
The only other garden I think that I've ever been to, well, actually, I used to work at American Horticulture Society, and standing in front of that house and looking at the Potomac is very much like being on your property. And then, of course, going down to Mount Vernon, that feeling when you stand on the back lawn and looking out at the Potomac, that's the kind of same feeling you get there too, which, American Horticulture Society used to be one of George Washington's farms, one of his 5 farms. So that feeling is there too, but that's a long way from the Delaware River. And so, yeah, it's really fascinating.
Jamie, just for point of genealogy, your grandfather and father, what were their names?
So my grandfather was Charles, and he was a lawyer in town, the law firm of Drinker, Biddle, and Reith. That's my grandfather is the Biddle. And then my dad was James, who I'm named for.
I echo Eva's sentiments about feeling like the estate is largely untouched, and the river really does bring a sense of peace and quietude. And just turning off the state road there onto the gravel, you don't have a paved drive up to the parking area, and it's a very quick and sweet transition from, basically the mayhem of coming out of Northeast Philly and finding that quietude.
There's a little interesting history about why the property remains as it is. And it's because Nicholas Biddle was a very successful financier and made a lot of money and poured that money into Andalusia and the renovation of the house and the creation of the gardens and the greenhouses that are now make up the graperies. But he lost all his money at the end of his life. So he ended up in a protracted battle with President Andrew Jackson, who didn't like the idea that there was a central bank and he wanted more state control of finances. And so he ended up removing the charter for the bank. That created a huge financial crisis in the country, and Nicholas Biddle got wiped out along with everybody else. So the family lost all their money, and all his kids lived in Andalusia, and they had no money to go anywhere else. And they also had no money to break the house. They couldn't modernize it. They couldn't do anything to it. And they lived there all the way into the early part of the 20th century. His youngest daughter lived until 1920. So the family stayed together on the property, but they didn't have the resources to modernize it or tear anything down. So it stayed sort of stuck in amber all the way into the 20th century. And that's why it is preserved the way it is today.
That could almost be a tagline: Andalusia estate stuck in amber.
Yeah, it really is.
I would love to have you tell our listeners about the Andalusia Garden Symposium that's coming up later this spring. I've been able to attend. I know Eva's been to a couple of them. I thought it was very innovative and exciting to get started with it a few years ago. Can you tell us about how it came to be?
Yeah, well, this is all my wonderful wife, Kristen's doing. She and two of our trustees, June Smith and Wendy McDevitt, came up with the idea of the symposium. And Andalusia is really an English garden by its history and its roots. And its landscape is very much in that English landscape tradition. And so they started the symposium by bringing in speakers, but primarily originally from the UK, as well as some American speakers, and covering the gamut from garden design to head gardeners at some of the great gardens in England, flower designers. And so it's been an interesting collection of speakers. There's 4 speakers every year. It's a full-day event that takes place at Andalusia. And this year, they've got another great lineup of terrific speakers. Joe Thompson is coming, who's a UK garden designer, and Kelly Norris, who's an American and also won the Governor's Trophy and the gold medal at the Philadelphia Flower Show last year. And then the head gardener from the Beth Chatto Gardens in the UK is coming as well. And then Charlotte Harris, who's a 3-time gold medal winner at the Chelsea Flower Show. So really terrific lineup of speakers. And it's just a great event. I look across the audience and there's so many familiar faces from sort of across the horticultural and gardening community. But people are coming now from as far south as Virginia and as far north as Maine. So it's really fascinating to watch it grow. And I was just going to say it was a real testament to Kristen, June, and Wendy and all the work they've done to put it.
Yeah.
This is the first year that you're going to have the whole entire event on Andalusia's property.
Yes, the first 2 years we did the event itself off-site and then came onto the property for a tea and some book signing. But this year we're going to do the entire event on-site. So I think that'll be nice for everybody.
Well, we wish you continued success. And as I recall, there's a mission with the symposium, am I right, to raise funding for an endowed scholarship? Is that right?
It's an internship program. And so we have interns now that come to Andalusia every season, and that's funded by the symposium proceeds. So I think one of the challenges for the public gardening community is just finding enough young gardeners who are interested in the profession and finding the opportunities where they can get training. So we think that's an important part of our mission, is to be able to provide that learning experience. So, and the symposium has allowed us to do that, which is terrific.
Yeah.
And what better place to have it, have an internship on an old estate like yours and to have that sense of history. So, if they're starting out their career and they do an internship there, they're steeped in that historical significance of the land. And I think that that's really critical too.
Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity, and they get the chance to work with Bill Fuchs, which is also who's our gardener. And I think that's a great opportunity for interns as well.
Absolutely.
We always like to weave in a little bit of conversation, for better or for worse, Jamie, on how the Delaware Valley is handling or taking a beating perhaps with some of the climate issues. And I know a couple of years ago, the township just north of Andalusia Estate, Bristol, I think had 2 or 3 weather events that really flooded the immediate area. And I know Andalusia took on quite a bit of water. You just mentioned Bill Fuchs, who sent me some videos of that day. Do you have a sense of how the estate was impacted? I remember just lots and lots of water, and the river was really swollen that day.
Yeah, so for us, that was 2019.
Right.
And it was devastating for us. It was a combination of the flooding and then high winds. And so we lost about a dozen fully mature tulip poplars that had been planted all along what's called the River Walk, which is a walk that sort of strolls along the front lawn at Andalusia and down by the river. And these were 100-foot plus tall, mature tulip poplars. And but combination of the wet ground and the high wind just knocked them all over like bowling pins. And the next day we had, a dozen or more of tulip poplars. There were a few oaks as well. And it completely changed the landscape of the front lawn. And then we had to think about, well, how are we going to replant this and what will we replant it with? And the first question was, how will we replant it? And Chris and I thought about it. Do we engage Arabella to come and think about how we should replant the lawn? And instead we ended up hiring a good friend of ours who's a painter, Rachel Constantine, who went to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art. And we asked Rachel to come paint the house from the river view the way she would see the house framed. And she ended up with a very simple design of just a copper beech planted on the left side to provide that framing on the downside river view. And so we ended up just planting a single copper beech there. And then we had to plant along the river walk to create shade. But obviously, tulip poplars were not the right answer to replant. As you guys know, which I didn't at the time, but have since learned, it's a tree with a very small root base. And it obviously grows very tall. And it's a tree that's designed to grow together in the woods. It's not designed as a specimen tree to sit on a lawn. So when it gets to be 100 feet tall and high wind hits and the ground is moist, it just falls over. So we had to think about what to replant. And assuming that with some of the impacts of climate change, this was not going to be a unique event. We were going to be dealing with more water, higher temperatures. And so we had to come up with some new ideas for what to plant. And that's all been planted out now. And we'll see how it all grows in.
So one of the things I think is really important on your property, and you don't see it that frequently, are 2 amazing Picea orientalis, the oriental spruce. And those are the most beautiful specimens I've ever seen. And so if people are coming to visit the garden, I think that they should think about the trees and look at the trees to get ideas for their own properties. And you have some wonderful Kentucky coffee trees. And as Hal and I always talk about your persimmons, there's nobody that has persimmons like you do. And you go to a garden and somebody says, well, what do you like about the garden? That garden has Euonymus atropurpureus, or this garden has such and such. And your garden has the best big specimens along that river walk. And you may have lost some, but you still have some spectacular ones. I even love your Sorbus ulnifolia that you have towards the back area. That's beautiful too. And the beautiful fruits in the fall. So yeah, Hal, what's your favorite that's there on the river walk?
I think, and I hope it's still standing, Jamie, there was one of the iconic American sycamores.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, one of those trees that can take a beating.
Exactly.
Keep on ticking. It's funny how I forget everything, but I can remember specific trees. And I do remember some kind of gaping cavity from decades ago, some kind of injury it sustained. But I'm very glad to hear. And sycamores are a tree that like it along the river.
Yes.
So
yeah. No, the sycamores have done well. I mean, it's extraordinary, the trees that are there. My interest in trees is relatively new. I'm an investor by professions, but in 2019, Kristen thought it would be a good idea that if we registered as an arboretum, but to do that, we had to have a list of all of our trees in a database, and we didn't have any. So I signed up for the project. I had no idea what I was signing up for, but I started out with a map of Andalusia and divided it into a grid, and then I went kind of grid block by block, and with one of those rolling measuring tapes, and measured the distance of every tree from the infrastructure on the map, and dutifully put it on the map. And then we started to try to identify what the trees were. And thankfully, obviously, having Bill Fuchs and Kristen is a tremendous asset, so they were very helpful. And then my dad had kept great records of every tree he had bought and planted. He kept the invoice. And then on it, he would scrawl, where he planted it generally. So then I could go out with these invoices, and then I could go look and try to find the tree and then put it on the map. And so I worked on this for a year, and we finally kind of got to the end. I had quite a number of trees that I couldn't figure out. And so when I had maybe a couple of dozen, I'd call up Paul Meyer, the retired head of the Morris Arboretum, who is unfortunately no longer with us. And Paul was wonderful. He would come out and walk around with me, and he'd go, okay, well, Jamie, this is this, and this is that. And I would go to it. So a year later, we had identified 1,000 trees and had them all labeled, and then we're able to apply for Arboretum status. So it was a great journey. And I learned a few things about trees as a rank amateur, but it was a great fun for me.
I was trying to remember the other day, who is the sanctioning body, if you will? How does an institution, who do they apply to become an arboretum? Anyone remember that?
Yeah, it's called ARPNet, and it's part of Morton Arboretum.
Okay.
Right. And they are really spectacular to work with, aren't they?
It's been great, and it's been super helpful for us to learn a lot about the process. And of course, that's got us hooked. So we keep planting trees. We plant about 50 trees a year, so it keeps getting bigger. The last time Arabella was over for a visit, she cautioned me. She said, James, you can either have a landscape or you can have a tree collection. You need to decide.
Why not both?
Well, that's my answer. Why not both? Why can't we have both? So we've really focused on trying to find beautiful specimens of wonderful trees. And Eva, you mentioned it. One of my frustrations as an amateur gardener is you look at something at a nursery and it's 2 feet tall or 4 feet tall, trying to figure out, well, what's this going to look like in my garden? So going to an arboretum, my view is a little bit should be like going to the candy store. Like, okay, look around and see what these trees look like and what they look like when they're mature, and make sure everything is labeled so you can figure it out. So we've tried to do that, and I hope people will come if they're thinking about planting something and get some ideas from what's in Andalusia.
It's really funny. We were saying you're in investments, and you're actually doing the same with the trees. You're getting them when they're small, and you're investing them onto your property, and you're seeing the results of that investment over time. And I think that that's pretty much what money does over time.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair.
I like that.
Just recently, I did a talk last night about value of trees, and the idea that as we increase our tree size, it becomes more valuable because it's holding carbon, but it's also taking that stormwater that you may have along the river and absorbing it, or it's doing some other function like cleaning the air and capturing particles out of the sky. And all that to me is investment for the future. And there are a lot of people who don't even look at it that way. They just...
Yeah, no, that's true.
And you're fortunate that you have that historical significance with your dad and your grandfather of the trees and planting of them, that you are now actually reaping the benefit of those trees to see and to share with other people. And not everybody has that foresight.
I think that's one of the great, tremendous benefits of living in the same place for almost 250 years. That, the things that my great grandmother planted and my grandfather planted, those trees are all still there. And so every time I plant a tree, I think about the generations to come. And now it's just not for my family. Now it's for everybody who can come and share it, which is, I think, what makes it really, really special for us, Dan.
So that makes your investment even more valuable.
Absolutely.
I have had the opportunity to work with Bill a little bit with the tree search end of things, and I was always impressed how far-reaching the estate would go to track down a special tree. And it wasn't like we're going to spend $10,000 and use a tree spade to plant a 6-inch diameter tree. It was always reasonably sized plant material. But I do remember Bill talking about making a Delaware or southern New Jersey to, track down that special oak or maple or something along those lines. And the payoff is very evident. And it's so great to see a mix of young stuff that's been planted in the last 5 or 7 years versus the stuff, as you say, that's been around 100 years or more.
Yeah, I think as an amateur tree hunter, I've learned a lot in the process. And one of the biggest challenges, I think, is so many commercial nurseries grow the same material. And it's because that's what people want. So it's hard to find things that are different or unusual. And then so many family nurseries now are out of business, where the next generation hasn't really wanted to take over. And so the nurseries close. So, a lot of the places that grew interesting things are falling to the wayside. So it's getting harder and harder to find specimens and interesting trees that people don't see on a regular basis. So we do have to hunt far and wide to try to find them.
My grandfather was an arborist, so I'm second generation. He brought me into the business. He actually grew up in Bernathen, Pennsylvania, so not that far from Andalusia. And I remember him saying grandfatherly advice. He said, "You'll never stop learning about trees," which when I was 17, 18, it's like, cue the eye roll. But one thing anecdotally I can share, Jamie, a tree I'm sure you're very familiar with because it's very close to the residence, is the Princeton elm. Yes. Right outside. I had always heard, Princeton elm, it's a great tree. Princeton University has beautiful ones. But I never realized how much structural pruning they needed when they were young. And I think every other year, for as long as I was doing some projects there, we were aggressively taking low limbs off. And I know a lot of the times those limbs were arching right towards the roof of your house. And you'd think, didn't we just take 3 big limbs off last year? And here we are pruning it again, so. And I've heard an elm expert years ago say, if you plant a Princeton elm, plan on pruning it once a year for the first decade.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming it's looking great. I sure hope it is at this point.
No, it is absolutely looking great. Again, that's what's sort of fun. There are trees like that were, first planted, I think, when they went into production.
Right.
My dad bought one of the early ones and planted it. So now it's a fairly mature tree, which is fun to see. There's a great Dawn redwood on the property that planted sometime in the early 60s, which is when they were brought to the country for the first time. And so in our area, there's Summit Longwood Gardens, and I'm not sure who brought them and who spread them around, but I suspect this was part of that process of bringing those first Dawn redwood in. Yeah, yep. And it's a beautiful specimen.
I have to say, and I have to point out to the listeners that if you come to Andalusia, you have to take a look at their paper bark maple, Acer Gricium. Oh my gosh. Everybody who comes, every student I've ever brought, oh my gosh, this is the most beautiful Acer Gricium we've ever seen. It is picture perfect. And I use it in a lot of lectures because I want people to see how beautiful the tree is without having to do a lot of pruning once it's established and once you have it in the right spot. It takes on this beautiful pyramidal form, and the bark is so beautiful in the wintertime. So it doesn't make a difference when you see it, what time of year, it is always beautiful. I talk about your tree a lot.
It's a terrific one. One of the favorites for sure.
So you talked earlier about being in London and getting to meet Arabella. And I wonder if you could talk about some of the projects that she handled for you and Kristen when she came stateside. Did she develop like a master plan, or was there a focus to specific areas?
Yeah, it started with a master plan, and then we have slowly but surely sort of knocked out pieces of the plan as we've gone along. So it began with the restoration of the original White Garden that my father had planted after having gone to Sissinghurst and in England to see the White Garden at Sissinghurst. And what's really fun is that Troy Scott Smith, who's the head gardener at Sissinghurst, spoke at the symposium last year and then is now doing a consulting project with us at Andalusia, and he'll be here in April. So it's sort of fun to have the White Garden in honor of Sissinghurst. So that was part of it. And then the Green Walk, my dad had planted the original Green Walk, but Andalusia is half the property is open to the public and half of the property is still our home. But there's no fence sort of down the middle of the property, as you guys know. So everyone is welcome to wander around, and people often pop into our kitchen and say hello while we're having lunch or whatever. So Arabella, thought there should be more of a demarcation line to separate it. So, and then she planted under the original pink dogwoods that were there, seasonal plantings that would be appropriate under those trees. And that really transformed the whole experience of getting into the gardens. And she planted a rondel at the head of the river walk that's all rhododendrons. It's really beautiful. So that was her first phase there. And then we just kept going down the green walk. We created a garden we call the Father's Garden in honor of my dad. And then his conifer border. He had rescued a collection of dwarf conifers from a man who had built a collection somewhere in Bucks County and was at the end of his life and was worried about what was going to happen to his tree collection. And so my dad agreed to take all of the conifers and move them to Andalusia and have them installed to preserve this gentleman's garden. And so it was all done in the 1960s. Now, a lot of those conifers are no longer with us. So Arabella redesigned that conifer border to incorporate the mature specimens that were still there and add some other things in it as well. And then last year, she's made some changes to the rose garden. So visitors will see that this year with some additional rose pillars that'll be added at the front of the rose garden. So you can actually see the roses as you come down the green walk. You'll know when you've come to the walled garden when you see the rose pillars. So that'll be exciting to install. And we're having those made in England and shipped over this spring.
That sounds really exciting. Wow.
So as you guys know, a garden is, to me, it's like a painting that you never stop painting. It just keeps changing and you add something new to it and something else needs to be changed and something else grows and now you have to rethink everything. And it's a constant journey.
I was going to point out that you have two beautiful Amelanchier canadensis, which are spectacular. And again, specimens I've never seen anywhere like those. They're just gorgeous when you come to the end of the peony walk. Yeah, I just have to commend you for the specimens that you have. They're eye-popping, especially when they're in bloom.
They are. I mean, it's hard. People often ask me what are my favorite trees, and it's like, what are your favorite children? And in this case, we have 1,000 of them. So, how do you pick your favorites? But there really are some beautiful specimens at Andalusia. I love the weeping European hornbeams that are by the cottage. And then next to them or across from them are these beautiful Chinese scholar trees that are terrific. And then one of my favorites is there's a shagbark hickory that sits in the Father's Garden right behind the ice house. That may be one of the oldest trees on the property. And it's just a spectacular specimen. And that beautiful shaggy bark and the fall color is just gorgeous. So love that tree. And then Bill Fuchs planted a Cercis canadensis. It's called Pauline Lily. And it has kind of a salmon-colored flower in the winter. It's usually either get the white or the sort of purpley or pink, but this is kind of a salmon-colored flower, which is really just spectacular. And then we have that gorgeous Cunninghamia, and I've never been able to find any history of who planted it, but it clearly was as broad as a specimen to Andalusia, and a long time ago, because it's a huge tree. But who brought it and how it planted there, I just don't know. But it's a beautiful tree, one of my favorites. I
think that one there is probably from when it originally came to this country, because up until about the 1980s, you didn't see them.
Yeah.
If it was before that, then it must have come from one of the original lots.
I think so, because our records are pretty good into the 1960s. So, and I have no record of the tree. So I just don't know when it was planted, but a beautiful tree and a beautiful specimen. And then visitors love the weeping European beech that's in front of the cottage, particularly the children. That's their favorite place to go, inside that beech tree. So hopefully we can fend off the beech leaf disease for a bit longer. Yeah.
We're all holding our breath on that one.
I know.
Yeah, Cunninghamia, I wish it was more widely available because it does not seem to be missing a beat in terms of its vigor and resistance to environmental stress. That it's just growing strong, dark green, really puts out a lot of growth, interesting form. I think the landscapes and the tree collections for homeowners in the greater Northeast could really benefit if you could find one at the nursery. But my experience is you never see them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to just mention that there's a blue form of Cunninghamia, which is really spectacular. We have one at Longwood, and every time I take the students up on Conifer Knoll there, they look at it and they're like, who is this? And then we stop dead in their tracks because it's so beautiful.
Yeah.
Just an FYI.
Yeah.
Jamie, Troy from Sissinghurst is going to do some consulting for you. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're going to have him look at?
Really, it's twofold. One is simply an operational perspective. So we want to get Troy's input on how he runs things at Sissinghurst, and is there any advice he can share with Bill Fuchs about how we're running our operation, how it compares to how they run their operation. Are there any efficiencies we can learn, and any good advice? And then, of course, Troy has just a spectacular eye. So always great to have his view on what we're doing and get any suggestions that he might have. So, and then as part of our intern program, we'll be sending some of our young professionals over to Sissinghurst to have an opportunity to be there for a week or two and study under Troy in the garden at Sissinghurst. So that'll be pretty neat.
Fantastic.
That's wonderful.
Jumping back to some historical context, one thing I learned, Andalusia Estate's about 100 acres, but the woodland that rings it is very pristine and it almost seems untouched in a lot of ways. And I'm assuming, though, my question here is, when Nicholas residing at Andalusia, was it all farmland? And am I looking at second and third generation forest?
Yeah, so a lot of it was farmland, but we do have one of the last and oldest sweet gum oak coastal plain forests left in Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And that's designated as an S1 community, so the rarest communities in the state. And so that forest that wraps around Andalusia is in itself a unique specimen. So people drive through it to get into the gardens and the arboretum, but what they're actually driving through and past is pretty special too.
Wow. Yeah, I really appreciate that clarification, because not to oak and sweet gum, definitely the two species that are very evident. And I didn't even know that was a thing, but it sounds like foresters have categorized it accordingly as S1, you said?
Yeah, exactly, in the state. So, and there's terrific streams and wetlands and vernal pools and wet meadows that are all important part of the ecosystem of the Delaware River that are preserved within the 100 acres. And with that brings all kinds of wildlife. So we have bald eagles and fox and all kinds of things that you don't think of seeing in the city of Philadelphia, but here they all are. Now, I wish we had fewer deer than we have, so that's a challenge. And as much as I love groundhogs to look at, they are extraordinary eating machines and can destroy a garden in about 15 minutes. So there's not all the wildlife is
absolutely, yeah. Bring on the coyotes.
Yeah, exactly.
You just lost a very big specimen, willow oak, and that was just a gorgeous tree. And you do have willow oak on your property, which is not very common in Pennsylvania. It's common in New Jersey, but not in Pennsylvania. And I was thinking to myself, well, you're right across the river from New Jersey, and you have birds going up and down there. So I wonder how much of the plant material that you get on your property comes from birds who are visiting your property that were already in New Jersey.
I'm sure, certainly originally, and of course in the woods as well. But in terms of the formal parts of the garden, everything has been so well planned for the last 100 years. A lot of those willow oaks were planted by my grandfather, and they were his favorite tree. So that's why we have so many willow oaks, and they're very intentionally planted. But boy, losing that giant willow oak was a terrible day when that tree came down. But what was fascinating is I think we all thought that tree had to be, 150 years old or more. And when we took it down and counted the rings, I think Bill counted something like 80, 85 rings. So this huge tree grew really rapidly. And what's interesting is that the tree sat on the edge of the horse paddock. And in the summer, it was the only shade in the horse paddock. So the horses would gather underneath the big willow oak, and then their manure would fertilize the tree, and I think created this sort of hyper growth of that tree. And maybe that's why it actually had a relatively short life, even though it grew so big. But we were also amazed that it was as young as it was, given its girth.
I was reading somewhere that willow oaks in particular are very sensitive to loss. So when I was looking to study how we were going to take cuttings from it, because I brought the students there to take cuttings, which none of them ever worked, but we also collected acorns and they started to germinate. But they said that if a tree, especially willow oak, is connected with a farm animal, and when the farm animal disappears, the tree also can disappear because it's so heavily reliant on that animal. So I kind of thought, when did your horses leave? And then when did your tree start to decline? And, we don't really think about that too frequently, but they do have a close association with one another.
It's fascinating because that's exactly what happened. When the horses finally went to the reward, we didn't replace them. And that was about the time this tree started to decline. So
yeah,
maybe there was indeed a symbiotic relationship. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that was a frustrating loss. And I would say from an arboriculture standpoint and, what we were coming at it with in terms of nutrient assessment and bulk density to see if we had compacted soils. And we really, it was a mystery. We really never conclusively were able to diagnose anything. So what an interesting theory.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate all the hard work, Hal. You really tried hard to save that tree.
I counted those rings as well. I did not believe what Bill was telling me. And I'm not a very good ring counter because I'm a little nearsighted, but I came up with about 85 years myself.
Amazing.
We had one on Temple's campus that everybody thought was a couple hundred years old. And then it started to decline with leaf scorch. And it turned out that the last 25 years or so were really stressed out. And it turns out that this tree, pretty much its whole youthful part of its life, was sitting on top of a septic system. And nobody knew that because the cottage had been removed and the septic system stopped being used. Then the tree took a long 20-year decline.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And it also surprised everybody. It was 98 years old. Everybody thought it was like 200. That's pretty funny. Well, we're going to ask our favorite question. Do you have a favorite tree?
Well, we talked about a lot of them. So I think we've sort of covered my favorite specimens. I think one of the things that's amazing about Andalusia is its collection of trees. So the things I always think about is the tulip poplars, which you notice as soon as you come down the drive. These beautiful, 100-foot tall, mature tulip poplars. And they always make me think of Andalusia. We have a great collection of hickories. I think every variety of hickories can be found there. And because of their taproot, they're very hard to transplant. So these are mostly there naturally. So it's great to see them, particularly in the fall, because the fall colors in hickories are amazing. So I think an underappreciated tree, and I'm a big fan. And then we have a very large collection of dogwoods. And they really began with my grandmother, who was from New Orleans and loved dogwoods. And so she began to plant dogwoods at Andalusia. And they're not a very long-lived tree. So we keep always replacing them and expanding the collection. But every time there's a new cultivar that comes out, I rush out and plant it to see how it will do. So we have quite a collection of different dogwoods, which is lovely. So I think it's an experience of a lot of things. We have a great collection of oaks, many that originally were native, but we've planted things that we didn't have into the arboretum. So there's much to love there, I think.
Well, my favorite tree is the Princeton elm. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but spectacular.
That's the one you were working on.
That was a joke, yes. Well, before we let you go, Jamie, can you tell us the date of your symposium?
Yes.
And
it's May the 1st, Thursday, May the 1st. And it's a full day event. Starts with breakfast. We provide you lunch as well, and then ends with afternoon tea. And there's the 4 speakers, and then afterwards it's an opportunity to gather with them and meet them and get signed books, as well as wander in the gardens and enjoy a little English tea. So it's a wonderful day, and we hope people will come out.
And, some of our listeners are going to hear about this after the symposium, full disclosure, but it is an annual event. And so to our listeners, if you happen to miss it this year, keep an eye on it for next year.
Exactly. It's always the same time every year. It's the first Thursday in May, and it'll always be an interesting collection of speakers, with at least half of them coming from England. So gives a little different perspective.
Yes, and there's nothing like spring in the Delaware Valley. So to be out on the estate in late April, early May is a fabulous experience.
Absolutely. We open for the season 1st of April. So I hope everyone will come out and enjoy the gardens. As you guys well know, what's wonderful about a garden is that it's always changing and evolving throughout the season. So once you come see it in April, it will look very different 3 weeks later and as it rolls through the season. So,
right.
Can you give us your website?
Yes, it's andalusiapa.org.
Great. And they can find the symposium information on there.
Absolutely.
Great. We are so thrilled that you could be with us today and talk about the wonderful garden of Andalusia. And we wish you continued success with all the work that you do and the tree protection that you constantly are maintaining. And we're just excited about it.
Well, thank you. And thank you both for everything you guys have done for Andalusia. It's been terrific. You've been a great resource for us as we've sort of tried to figure our way into the future.
Thanks so much, Jamie. Great to see you.
Take care.
Alrighty. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
The Plant a Trillion Trees podcast is edited by Andromedan Recordings in Hollywood, California.